Thank you, Shala, for the kind words of introduction. Professor Stephen Cordner, the chairperson, dear colleagues, let me first of all take this opportunity to thank the Victorian Institute of Forensic. Let me first of all express my sincere thanks for giving me the opportunity to talk to you about my experience and knowledge that I have acquired during my about 5-year stay in Kosovo. Let me first of all express my sincere thanks to Professor Stephen Cordner from the Victorian Institute of Forensic Medicine, and also for Shala from the ICRC for giving me the opportunity to share with you about my experience and the knowledge that I have acquired during my 5 years of stay in Kosovo, doing forensic investigations under United Nations administration in Kosovo. So the topic that I am going to present to you is the lessons learned from Kosovo and situation in Sri Lanka, and how best that the lessons learned could be applied to my own country. Now, Kosovo, as you know, is in the Balkan region. It is a landlocked country which has a population about 2.5 million, and out of them, most are Muslims, about 90%, and others Orthodox, who has a Serbian origin or links with Serbia. Now, if you very shortly go to the background situation in Kosovo, which led to the conflict situation, is that it was a political, religious and ethnic conflict between Kosovo Albanians, the Muslims, and Serbians, the mostly Orthodox, had been going on for many years in Kosovo, which is a province in the former Yugoslavia. This conflict finally led to an armed struggle in 1998-1999, killing many people and disappearance of several others, until the arrival of NATO forces and subsequently establishment of the United Nations administration mission in Kosovo, which is known as UNMIK, in 1999. The disappearance, however, continued for some time even after the arrival of NATO and establishment of UNMIK. Now, very briefly to tell about the post-conflict situation in Kosovo. Now, after 1998-1999 conflict in Kosovo, about 5,206 persons were reported missing. However, there was a claim about 10,000 missing, has no any evidential basis. Exhumations of remains done with no identification at the beginning. In many who were reported missing, no remains found and no reliable information about them. There was a general lack of progress in finding information about them in a systemic and coordinated manner. This is just after the UN administration was set up the situation. On the initiative of ICTY, that is International Criminal Tribunal for Yugoslavia, in 1999, all available forensic teams were deployed for forensic operations with no standard operating procedures. There were no SOPs. No priority for identification of imminent humanitarian concerns, but mainly focusing on criminal prosecution, leading to legacy of disorganization and missing information on the missing. So actually this has been done in a bit of a disorganized manner, and the main concern was about criminal prosecution. But the humanitarian aspect had not been given due consideration at the beginning. This was the situation even in Bosnia, as mentioned by Shola. Failure to solve the problems of missing, United Nations Mission in Kosovo initiated Victim Recovery and Identification Commission, which was known as VRIC in 1999, and in 2000, Bureau of Detainees and Missing Persons also was established. That was another organization. Then at this time, CVPOL, CCIU and RIU conducted criminal investigations, and missing person unit that was created to gather information about disappearance. This became the responsible for exhumation, identification and return of remains to families. Now, MPU, the missing persons unit, the officers of that, they signed, so they didn't have adequate forensic experience of any form. Whenever remains were recovered, autopsies were initially done by doctors of Medical Legal Institute of Pristina, which was a unit responsible for medical legal work in Kosovo prior to the conflict and during the conflict period, with an anthropologist from OSCE, and they later hired SIFA. In June 2002, Office on Missing Persons and Forensics, where I worked, was established. And this was an operational body with forensic capabilities, and this was created by UNMIC due to pressure from families of missing demanding concrete action, and the MPU, which was the functioning body, was unable to cope up with the demand. And finally, this led to dismantling of the MPU. However, there was no clear mandate to OMPF, or required resources were not adequately made available at the beginning to complete its work and the tasks. The missing persons unit was later transformed into war crime unit with the mandate of investigation of criminal acts of forced disappearance. So their mandate, or the task was limited to that. Then the OMPF became responsible to find whereabouts of missing, to find the graves, and had sole authority to perform exhumations and autopsies. There was a government commission on missing of the Prime Minister, which is known as a GCMP. This is an office that was later created with the intention of acquiring the responsibilities of the OMPF on missing, but that also sans technical skills for the forensic operation, and therefore it became unsuccessful. Then there was a parliamentary commission on missing, which is mainly a political body, that also was established, but that also was, though it was established, there were not much of a use, and that also became unsuccessful. And there are many NGOs of which Family Association of the Missing offers various support, and sometimes even launch protest for the delay in recovery of remains and identify those who are missing. But it acts as a principal liaison between the OMPF and various communities. These associations have formed a coordinating council, but there is considerable differences of opinion among them and internal disputes. The Council for Defense of Human Rights and Freedom is also active on the issue of missing in municipalities, in the local areas. Now you see, there was so many organizations who was involved and was interested in the issue of missing in Kosovo. The ICMP, the International Commission of Missing Persons, an American-led organization based in Sarajevo in Bosnia, is aiming to identify at that time missing using DNA. The OMPA and ICMP had a memorandum of understanding for DNA testing on bone samples of remains of missing. So, and in fact, it was ICMP who was doing the the DNA analysis for the Office of Missing Persons and Forensics to help the scientific establishment of the identification. The ICRC has been active as a neutral observer and chairs the working group on missing persons between Pristina and Belgrade. I understand that even this is continuing even today. Now, ICRC had been present in Kosovo at the time of conflict and even before. Soon after the conflict, it did its best to organize the forensic operations, focusing on identification of humanitarian aspects with little success due to resistance and lack of cooperation by the ICTY that had the legal authority. Because that the ICTY was mainly interested about the prosecution, whereas the interest of the ICRC was mostly humanitarian and identification. So there was some difference in the objectives. ICRC was the first to start collecting information on the missing of the minority that had escalated after arrival of NATO forces. So what happened was that after arrival of NATO, there was the violence perpetrated towards the minority. The Serbians became a minority because most Serbians left the main cities and they became minority. They were sort of confined to certain pockets of small villages. Then the Albanians start attacking on them. So the deaths or the missing among Serbians became more apparent after arrival of NATO. As a result of ICRC initiation, it was possible to collect antemortem information of missing that had been collected by various groups, because prior to the ICRC starting this, the various organizations and NGOs and so on had their own operations and had certain information collected, but there was no consolidated list or document of missing. So the ICRC is the one who started coordinating this, and finally a consolidated list of missing was established. I think this has been updated regularly, and ICRC is the authoritative organization for maintaining and updating the consolidated missing in Kosovo, even today, my understanding, which is very important. ICRC continued to cooperate with the OMPF for its all forensic operations on the missing, scheduling and assisting in family visits and transfers, helping in clothing exhibitions, and providing training on psychology for outreach officers, handover remains to families. The one peculiar situation in the Kosovo operations was that sometimes we find graves where the remains are finally identified as the remains of Serbs, and those remains has to be transported across the border. So the cross-border transportation of remains is also an issue, and I think still it's continued to be an issue in Kosovo, because the people who have been living in Kosovo, the Serbians, some of the families have gone back or migrated to Serbia. Then the important aspect of the community investigation in the search for the whereabouts of persons unaccounted for, that is those who are missing. Now basically this is done through the contacts with the family members and those who have information regarding events of disappearance. That is a main source of information. Now this must be distinguished from the criminal investigation. This is a more of a humanitarian event compared to a criminal investigation of finding a whereabout of a victim of a war crime for the purpose of prosecution. Though finally that that's the identification becomes a common thing, but the process there is certain differences. Now the face of the mass graves have been often used when discussing the aftermath of the conflict in Kosovo. Now there were no mass graves except one in Klina in April 2005, which has about 25 bodies that have been found by the forensic personnel since the arrival of NATO forces in Kosovo. So the technical mass graves were very few in Kosovo. There were many reasons for that. One reason was that it was told that before arrival of NATO, the remains have been taken away and buried in Serbia. So that is why the mass graves are not found. But I mean, whatever it is, that no real the large number of mass graves containing large number of bodies have been detected in larger number in Kosovo. However, there is evidence to suggest that such illicit burial sites existed prior to NATO occupation, and that the bodies were removed to mass graves in Serbia proper. Now this is interviewing a family member to get certain informations. Now the OMPF has three principles in its operations. Mainly it was a humanitarian kind of a approach. Then it was a centralized exercise, and the third one was the local capacity building. Because the OMPF, though it has a mandate of identifying and assisting the UN for criminal prosecution, it also had to do the day-to-day forensic work in Kosovo, and also to do the capacity building, infrastructure as well as manpower. So the forensic work is conducted with the primary aim of identifying victims of the conflict and early returning of remains to their families. That was one of the primary objectives. Now, centralization of all forensic operations in Kosovo, which had been not happening before establishment of the OMPF. Then technical and humanitarian resource development needed by Kosovo to continue to carry out search for missing and establishing identity, because the technical capabilities and expertise and also the infrastructure facility was found to be very poor and not up to the optimum standard that were required. So the OMPA had to look into this aspect. This is just to outline you about the organogram or the organizational structure of the Office of Missing Person and Forensics, which was established in Kosovo. Now it has mainly two sections. Medical Examiner's Office, where I happen to be its head for 5 years, from 2004 till 2009, and it also has another section mainly dealing with missing persons. That is a missing persons operation section led by another person. But these two sections works hand in hand, in particularly when it comes to operations on missing persons issues. And under these two there are common structures, and also there's interrelationship. Now this is a methodology of the OMPF operations for missing persons. Now, as you know, the basis starting point is the community investigations. It's done in different ways, and to collect information and assess suspected graves and exhume them when necessary. Then to perform autopsies of unidentified remains, to determine the cause of death, and to collect information and material, including DNA, to establish the identity forensically or scientifically. Then also families of the missing persons are informed when the identity is certain or beyond reasonable doubt, and the arrangements are made for the early return of the remains, and to do burial in a dignified manner. And also finally, all the informations and the operations and all the records are kept in archives. So this is the basis of the OMPF operations. Now, when it comes to the ground level operational system, it missing persons in operations, forensic operations, that means missing persons. It has two parallel ways of doing it. Now, on my left hand, that shows that for the gathering of information and collection of antemortem information and completion of the consolidated list of missing persons is going on one side, and at the same time on the other way, now the technical aspects are also being done. Now, exploratory process in search of unclaimed and unidentified human remains, looking for grave sites. The ones that have been suspected sites are being scientifically investigated, and then if the positive by various, it is found to be positive, then the actions is taken for to start doing the excavations or exhumations. The legal requirements, the technical requirements are looked into. Then finally, if the remains are found, the remains are transferred to the mortuary for autopsy examination. Then the mortuary operations, based on confirmation of the identity and the other things like establishment, cause of death, and etc. Then at the same time, from the outreach section of the missing persons unit, they visit families and convey informations. And finally, once identity is established, handover and reburial is arranged. Now, this was the old mortuary complex located about 75 kilometers out of Pristina. It was formerly a factory, and a certain part of this factory premises has been converted. And this was the main mortuary site from 1999 to 2002 for ICTY, and thereafter up to June 2006. In 2006, a brand new OMPF complex was built in Pristina. Now this shows the before the burial, sometimes the mass burial of the families, and the people are allowed to come and pay their last respects. This sometimes is necessary to do the cross-border repatriations in the transferring bodies from Serbia to Kosovo, where the remains are found in Serbia, or if the remains are found and identified in Kosovo and they happen to be Serbians, where the families are living in Serbia, the arrangement has to be made for repatriation to Serbia. Then this is basically the handing over process. I am not going into the details of it. It is done in the standard manner. Now this is just showing one of the early actions of the grave sites. The task of the identification section, that is missing person section, its determination of the identity of the human remains in the OMPF is the main task here. Then establishment of the cause of death and the other identification features, full autopsy and collection of bone samples for DNA, disappearance and follow-up, and also associating post-mortem records with the missing persons data. This is the identification process. Now, the collective identification versus individual identification. Because sometimes it has been found that the certain family members have been buried in the same grave site. So in such a situation where individual identification of remains becomes not feasible, practicable, then the collective identification is made. Clothing exhibitions are conducted, again to assist identification of remains. Then collection of artifacts, their preservations. Now let me very briefly tell the problems that we have encountered in the OMPF due to previous forensic operations. Now problems created by ICTY operations due to unplanned, non-centralized, non-standardized, uncoordinated procedure done for the sole purpose of criminal prosecution with no adequate concern on the humanitarian aspects and denial of information to families of the missing. That was one of the major problems that the OMPF has to face. Then there were no systemic records about exhumations, identification remains and reburial. So this has led to a situation where over and over again already autopsied bodies had to be re-exhumed and do the autopsies again, because sometimes there was no records available, the identity for the purpose of establishing identity, no data available, so there was no option other than to do the exhumations of already autopsies the remains. Then wide variety of quality and the standard of forensic work, autopsy exercise in different teams in different times. There were no standardized manner. So different people, different organizations had been done the autopsies and collected evidence in using their own standards, their own methods and following their own procedures. So that was another issue that the OMPF has to face. Some of the remains exhumed by ICTY were reburied without being identified and no record of burial site even. Now there were certain cases where no burial sites also was possible to identify. There were situations like that. Now just to tell you about the statistics, now this is up to March 2009 where I left OMPF. Up to that time, this may be have been updated thereafter, but the numbers are not much. The total number of individuals reported missing at the time of OMPF established in June 2002 was 5,326. That's according to ICRC figure. Then total number of persons still reported missing, 2,047. The OMP operations reduced the number of reported missing by more than 50% due to its operations. So this is a fairly successful rate of identification. Now unidentified bodies in OMPF in custody as of that day, minimum number of individuals was 476 at that time. Now total number of field operations that had been done were 532. Sets of human remains recovered 1,481 and sets of human remains returned to families 1,931, and there are about another 100 cases by then which has been identified but awaiting to be taken over by families, and I'm sure by now most of them have been returned to families. Now set of remains transferred back to Kosovo from Serbia was about 900, where the Serbians who have been killed and buried in Serbia, autopsies had been done in Serbia and then they were transferred, but the practice is that once they are transferred to Serbia, in most instances that there's another examination has to be carried out. So it's now the bodies that have been autopsied, the remains that have been autopsied in Serbia, when they are transferred back to Kosovo, because there was to build up the trust mainly, because there was a lot of queries about the authenticity and the accuracy of the cause of death and things like that, because it had been pointed out that most instances that cause of death has been given unascertained, where there were instances of having evidence of gunshot injuries and so on. So they were the allegations. So because of that, it was a practice to do the re-examination when the remains are returned from Serbia to Kosovo. Now, our experience from Kosovo tells that the focusing on the collection of forensic evidence for criminal investigation tend to preclude sustainable humanitarian solution. Conversely, prioritizing broader social issues of psychological trauma and institutional building does not jeopardize the use of forensic evidence for prosecution. The needs and the wishes of the families must be established from the outset and respected. The need for collective identification versus individual identification must be determined in consultation with community leaders where necessary. The issue of missing should not be considered an enduring condition of post-war situation of the country, but rather as a missing persons project with attainable goal. Is there a need for a continuation of missing persons operations? I think it's been accepted as yes. State Kosovo. Why? Not all those who are missing during the soon after conflict has been identified back, because this is the culture in Kosovo is that the families whom they are near and dear ones are missing, they keep on searching. They keep on searching. So much so, now if the number of family members are being missing and some of them have been found dead, even after identification, sometimes that they do not want to take remains of individual, that they wait, they keep the remains of individual until the other family members are also identified. So that's a culture, and they are very particular about certain things. So therefore, even my understanding is even today, the families where they are the missing relatives are not yet found are still wanting the missing operations to continue. Though the identified rate is comparatively a high figure, the families of those whom their loved ones are still missing must have a means of solving their grievances. So that is one of the main reasons why it should continue. There is a very high possibility of continuation of finding of human remains which need full forensic investigation for identification and for other legal issues. But my experience is, even in 2009, there were instances where the earth had been dug up for various other things and human remains has been recovered. Right? So therefore, this is going to be recovered the remains going to be recovered even in the future for some times. All missing person cases are potential war crime cases, and therefore full and complete investigation must be done as required by provisions of the law, local and international law. And who should do it? By whom? There must be a unit that continues the work done by missing person sections of the OMPF, consisting of properly trained local staff assisted by international experts. This unit should continuously work in close cooperation with the forensic medical section of the missing persons operations. Sustainability, infrastructure and human resource for continuation of missing person operations are in place with its European standard, and I think Professor Cordner, who did a survey some time back, said that standards are adequate. The plans have been drawn up for further development of forensic facilities. It appears that since inception, there had been a serious lack of coordination and political will to resolve the issue of missing person in Kosovo. The missing is still one of the most politically divisive issue for determination of future state of Kosovo. Now the politicians, they are losing the interest on solving the problem of missing. So therefore less and less emphasis is given for that. Now just a few words about the missing in Sri Lanka. Missing persons due to different reasons in Sri Lanka. There are tsunami victims, badly affected the country due to tsunami, dead and large number of dead and presumably dead people still missing is high in number. The missing persons due to conflict, died in action, presumably missing in action during last 3 decades. We have potentially high natural disasters due to floods, earth slips, etc. And we also have a fairly high figure of people who have died and buried unidentified. So that is a situation in Sri Lanka. Now, when it comes to tsunami victims, there was a lack of accurate data on missing and dead. Lack of consolidated list of missing still not been established. Though the various figures are given, there is no consolidated list of missing. Lack of post-mortem records of those who have died, and post-mortem has been done, or without post-mortem. Lack of records on burial sites. There are a large number of burial sites, but no evidence whatsoever where these bodies have been buried. Lack of antemortem data on those who were missing. Consequences due to bringing legislations just to facilitate the issuing of death certificates. There was some legislation brought in soon after tsunami to facilitate registration of deaths, which had a lot of consequences. Now, it has been found that certain criminals who had escaped during the tsunami period were reported as dead, but they were still living. So there were some of the problems. Now, the other issue is that those who are missing related to conflict, unrecorded number and data, lack of accurate data, and there was no system, practical difficulties in obtaining and maintaining data on those presumably dead or missing in action, and deliberate actions taken to conceal identity. So these are some of the issues related to the conflict. And there were certain plights of the bereaved family members, lack of proper authority to look for help or to complain, lack of motivation to enthusiasm by the law enforcement, lack of reliable system, cultural factors. The system, the lack of standard operation procedures, and so on and so on. There are certain system failures. The issue of missing persons should from the outset be coordinated by central organization, which is lacking in Sri Lanka, that will consolidate all relevant information and enforce standard of operation procedures still lacking in Sri Lanka. It should have strong humanitarian focus. In Sri Lanka, it is mainly these death investigations done, not like in Kosovo at the beginning, not on humanitarian grounds, mainly for the prosecution. And address the needs of the families of the missing is also not given due consideration. Include them in the process and sharing information with them. Development of the capacity of the local staff to continue forensic work is of the paramount importance. Thank you.